Welcome to this week's episode of Insights, which happens to be our year-end one. What we're going to close the year with sort of a different kind of show, where we're going to go around the countries, our neighboring countries in this region, and one by one look at political developments that can shape their relationship with us and their internal politics over the next year. Let's start with our southern neighbor, Iran. What's relevant last year with Iran, this year that is ending now, is the first, what happened in Lebanon and obviously in Gaza. Hezbollah, which was actually the crown jewel of Iranian foreign policy in many ways since the Islamic Revolution, took fatal hits in its war with Israel and has been not wiped out, but greatly decimated in its military and political capacities. This was obviously followed up last month with the collapse of the Assad government, a government which purportedly the Iranian state has spent almost $30 billion over the last 10 years propping up. All of this probably put the Iranian government at its weakest point since the end of the Iran-Iraq war. In some ways, it's actually weaker than that because at that time, the current government actually had a much wider base than it enjoys right now. Heading into next year with the return of Donald Trump as President of the United States, it's quite possible that we will see sort of a carte blanche for Israel to attack Iran and specifically its nuclear facilities. Now, Trump, as we know, it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, he ran as the president that's against war, while at the same time he supports very aggressive policies, and obviously, which I think this might be the year where both the United States and Israel go for the kill in being able to do things against Iran that would not have been approved of before. Now, what this does, it's impossible to predict. If the government and the regime's base is actually very narrow, it could actually greatly weaken it, or it could have the exact opposite effect of the Iranians are a very nationalist people, and they can rally around their government no matter what the government is, if it is under attack by her enemies. Any way you look at it, Iran at this point is a wounded country, but it still has the political proxy and military capacity to make things quite difficult for many of its adversaries in the region if we move towards full-scale war. Now we'll move to the country to the north of us, Georgia. What we're likely to see is that the current political crisis, which is the standoff between the government and the opposition, in regards to the legitimacy of the elections last year, is likely to continue. What's likely to also continue is Western pressures on this current government in trying to weaken it and eventually depose it. We will see what happens by the end of this year. Either this government falls and is replaced by a much more pro-Western or pro-EU government, or this government stays in power in a much weaker position. In a Georgia, they'll be ruling a Georgia that's frankly much more isolated in the world and likely in the long run a much poorer country. Let's move on to the behemoth to the north of us, Russia. Looking into this coming year, this could be the year that we end up actually having a ceasefire. I don't think a peace agreement, but a ceasefire in Ukraine that ends the war. A war that Russia can actually win from a technical point of view while actually losing the battle for its future. There's great hopes in Russia that somehow there's a deal to be had with Donald Trump to end this war. Obviously, I think the incoming administration is more geared towards ending the war, but I don't think there's any particular guarantees there, and Trump is frankly too unpredictable of a figure to have any concrete ideas of what's likely to happen. What we do know is that the economic sanctions on Russia are not going to be lifted, no matter what happens, short of regime change. Overall, unfortunately, if you look at it, this is a country that really doesn't have much of a future when it comes to political and economic development. In many ways, Putin's problems will start the day after the war ends. And let's go over some of the things that are likely to define post-war Russia. The first issues is all the political issues that have sort of been buried are going to come to the fore. And that is people and the elite and the population are going to ask, was all of this sacrifice worth it for a couple of 100 kilometers in Ukraine? Then you'll be dealing with issues of political legitimacy. What the Russian population has actually found over the last few years, that the people that have been ruling them, the emperors really have no clothes, and the elite really don't have that much credibility. One of the most interesting things you see, the discourse you see in Russia is the criticism, the attacks on the current government actually come from the right. It comes from nationalists who blame the corruption of the country or not being aggressive enough in the war. So we could actually be dealing with a situation where a post-Putin Russia is actually run by people that are far more nationalist than he is and far more aggressive. Economically, what's important is that large parts of the country outside of Moscow are actually benefited from this war. People who were used to getting salaries that was much lower are getting much higher salaries because of the pump priming that's going into the war of people, first of all, going to war or people working in the war industries. And these people are not going to go back to the salaries that they were living on before the start of the war. All of this is likely to be compounded one way or the other with what we're likely to see, which is collapse or a decline in gas prices over the next few years, and the war premium on oil, which is one of the main sources of Russian income and state budget, which is oil, actually coming down when the war premium lifts from the war in Ukraine. Any plan to end the war, any ceasefire, will not lift Western sanctions, which is key, because that they won't be lifted until there's actually regime change in Russia. The history of sanctions is that once they get into place, it is almost impossible to repeal them. In the long term, if you really look at it, Russia either capitulates itself back into the Western fold, or it becomes some gigantic version of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a country that can survive and cause lots of problems, but does not have the capacity to thrive in any way. Now let's move on to Turkey. After the jihadist-backed victory by Turkey in Syria, in many ways, the Turkish regime and Erdogan are actually at their highest point regionally as far as their influence goes. What we could be looking at is the start of the neo-Ottomanism that has been discussed, or this is where neo-Ottomanism goes to die in Syria. Turkey's actions over the last month have led to actually a great victory for the United States, for Israel, and the West. And in many ways, Turkey has established itself, along with Israel, as the go-to countries in all the primary decisions that happen in the region, while essentially outlining Iran and Russia in many ways out of this equation. However, at the same time, the Turkish state has become the proud owner of the world's poorest country outside of sub-Saharan Africa. Syria needs about $400 billion to repair the damage that has been done from the war over the last decade, and money that no one's going to come up with. Syria is also a country that, outside of the early Assad period, has actually no history of political functionality as a unitary state. And depending on U.S. decisions on Rojava and on eastern Syria, you could actually have a secondary self-ruled Kurdish area next to Turkey, if the U.S. so decides, and there's not much Turkey can do about that if the U.S. makes the decision to keep its forces in eastern Syria right under its nose, in the same way that you have another Kurdistan in northern Iraq that's ruled by a local autonomous Kurdish authority. It is very clear that the West, Israel, and the United States have always wanted Syria to be a failed state, because that is what is useful to them as far as what it does to Iran and Russia. But that is not what Turkey wants, because it doesn't serve its interests. But at the same time, it really doesn't have the economic capacity to turn Syria into a functional country and with a functional political or economic system. Lastly, what history tells us is jihadists that you unleash almost always come back to bite the hand that feeds them. Let's move on to Syria, the country in the news over the last month. There's really, if you really get down to it, there's one fundamental question about Syria and its future, which is to answer the following question is, once you're a jihadist headcutter, are you always a jihadist headcutter? If the answer to that is yes, well, the tolerance act that we've been seeing by the current terrorist regime that is running Syria will slowly give way to some kind of Taliban rule. And the Taliban are actually key. If you look at the second Taliban takeover after 2021, they did not start off killing people, telling women they can't go to school. That happened very slowly. The return to the 7th century was a slow roll and not done immediately, which could actually be the playbook of the current terrorists that are running Syria at this point. However, if I am wrong, and the answer is no, we could be looking at the development of a very interesting country that can actually create better outcomes for her people. I hope for the best, but unfortunately, I expect the worst. We're going to close by talking about our neighbor to the east of us, run by the regime in Baku. What we're going to focus on actually is a very long interview that was done on Russian television on the Azeri President Ilham Aliyev. And we're going to outline the things that him and his regime have been demanding as far as the negotiations with Armenia. Though some of them we've heard before. The first one was a demand to change our constitution again. He has demanded that the Armenian state start negotiating with a fictional Western Azerbaijan community for the right of return. Him and his henchmen have decided to demand for us to end any upgrade in our military and rearming of the country. In fact, he's actually hinted that he's willing to take military action to prevent change of the balance of power in the region. He has demanded a removal of the EU border monitors from the Armenia-Azerbaijan borders, which again tells you where his intentions are, because the monitors are simply on our side and they don't bother anyone. In this interview, he also married all of this with broad attacks on the West and specifically on Macron. In one case, actually making a very crude sexual reference about the Armenia-France relationship. All of this is a good hint at what we're likely to be looking at over the next year. And what we know for sure are the following. First, that there's not going to be any peace treaty that's going to be signed under any scenario. All of the demands that are being outlined are simply designed to prevent the signing of any peace treaty because they're pretty much unacceptable. It is also very clear they're preparing to attack. If you look at the number of flights, both from Israel and from other countries, of arms going into Azerbaijan, they're the highest they've been since 2020. So obviously there's a preparation to attack Armenia again if the opportunity is right. It's very clear from the rhetoric that they're upset about two things if you actually drive through it. The first one is they're very upset about the military upgrades of the purchase of weapon systems. And they're also exceptionally upset about the enhancement of Armenia-Western relationships, which is, I think, something that has come as a surprise to both to them and the Kremlin, because their idea was that there, frankly, is no market for Armenia in the West, and they have been proven wrong on that front. So ultimately, the question is, does this mean war next year? Frankly, that depends on a few factors. The first one is how out of control the regional political military situation gets. Secondly is how the regime calibrates what the response of both the United States and the EU would be attacking a sovereign nation of Armenia, not Artsakh, but the sovereign state of Armenia. What could be looking at as far as possibilities is a major incursion or invasion of Armenia. That is the least likely option. Small border skirmishes, that's quite likely. And if you look at their complaint about the EU monitors, that's obviously what they want to do, because without monitors, it's much easier to do these skirmishes and come up with excuses for them. They could attack military bases, because obviously they're talking about not allowing us to upgrade our military, so they can actually try to destroy capacities that we're building. Or lastly, they could do nothing. What they will do is based on a cost basis benefit scenario, so whatever helps regime survival. What we should do is, frankly, look at what they complain about the most and double down on it, which in this case is further expanding our military capacities and buying more weapons and upgrading our military, while at the same time integrating in a more significant way into Western power structures. In conclusion, what we might be actually looking at with Azerbaijan is it's sort of an upside-down Thucydides trap. For people who don't know what that is, that's a theory in which if there's a primary power in the world and there's a rising power, they will eventually go to war. What we might have is we might have that, but in an upside-down way. You have a country, Azerbaijan, that has the advantage now, but that advantage is going to dissipate over time because its economic capacities are going to dissipate over time. While at the same time, you have an Armenia that is likely to rise, is not guaranteed to rise, which makes it very tempting for the stronger party to try to settle their issues while they still have the advantage. This is in many ways the most dangerous period because Aliyev knows that every day that goes by, aggressions are going to get harder, which make aggressions much more tempting. On that happy note, I want to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We'll be taking a few weeks off and we'll be back in the middle of January. Thank you for joining me in this year-end version of Insights.
Give me back the Berlin Wall. Give me Stalin and St. Paul. I've seen the future, brother. It is murder. Things are gonna slide in all directions. Won't be nothing you can measure anymore. The blizzard of the world has crossed the threshold and it's overturned the order of the soul. When they said, repent, I wonder what they meant.
Nowadays, it seems like we all have to pick a side. To this we say bullshit. Independent media and free speech is what we choose. Thank you for joining us this year. See you in 25.